Welcome to episode 3 of the Pogmagol podcast.
Oh, it's a beautiful goal, isn't it? A beautiful goal.
What a save! Messi enganchó como le gusta, él probó con zurda.
Morta again, another time, the shot on the foot and in!
Oh, what a goal! What a goal that is!
What a goal from David Beckham!
Zinedine, passa.
Different class. Different class.
My name is James Carew, co-editor of the Pogmagol website and magazine, and we've launched this brand new podcast to coincide with the release of the very latest issue of the magazine, issue 6. Pogmagol is a website and magazine from Ireland which takes a close look at football culture, going beyond the action on the pitch to explore everything from historic players to the social impact of the game to the design of everything from stadiums to club crests. A brand new issue is now available to order from pogmagol.bigcartel.com or check us out on social media at Pogmagol. It's 64 pages of quality writing and art and illustration from contributors from places such as Japan, Argentina, Germany and further afield, and of course Ireland. On today's episode, we'll take another deeper look at a feature article from the magazine with the author of a piece which is both historical and topical. And joining me as ever is my co-host Joe Phelan. Welcome back, Joe.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm very well. Today's episode will explore the past, present and perhaps future of one of Ireland's most famous clubs, the Bohemian Football Club, or Bohs as they are known, a North Dublin institution making waves both on and off the pitch. So to start off, for his homework, I tasked Joe with an introduction to Bohs was the epic Coppa 90 Derby Days video, the Shamrock Rovers Dublin Derby. Did you watch it?
I did. I watched it. I've seen it before as well, because I remember it was one of the first things you ever said to me that your brother was one of the contributors to that. So I watched it again this afternoon, and the thing that struck me the first time I saw it was all of my family is Irish, and they either all support Liverpool or Man United. So I just kind of assumed that was the way it was all over the country, and I just think it's amazing that there are these. And I'm not trying to be dismissive or anything here, but these relatively small teams that have got such a passionate fan base, but they're not only trying to cheer on their team, they're also doing what they can to grow the sport. And I think that's something that can be forgotten when you support. I support Tottenham, and I don't do anything to. I don't feel like I'm progressing football in any way. I'm just supporting Tottenham, but but I've got a lot of fans who support lower league teams in the UK. So one of my best friends is a Bristol Rovers fan, and half of his time is spent trying to figure out if the club is going to stay in existence. Which is just a completely different side of football, and it's amazing that in the documentary this is the top tier of Irish football. These are the big two teams, and even then in the documentary they're saying if this match didn't exist, we don't even know if the clubs would be able to continue operating. It's just a completely different world, really.
I totally agree, Joe. And that's why we're delighted that today's guest is Jerry Farrell, who's a historian and presenter of a Bohemian Sporting Life podcast and website, and who describes himself as Bohemian in outlook and sporting affiliation. So welcome to the Pogmagol podcast, Jerry. And what does that mean?
Well, first of all, thanks guys for inviting me on, and thanks again for asking me to contribute to issue 6 of the magazine. I was only talking on a recent episode of the podcast, and if you look up dictionary definitions, which I know is a bit reductive, but if you look up a dictionary definition of a Bohemian, you get the quite dry answer that it's someone from the region of Bohemia, which I think is in the modern Czech Republic. Or one description I quite liked is someone who lives an unconventional lifestyle. So I quite like that. I think that's a nice. I don't know how unconventional I am, but I like to think I'm a little bit. I'm getting older these days, so I'm probably getting a bit more boring and staid. But I suppose that's a nice description for someone who's a bohemian. And I do think that the club, you might call it nominative determinism, the club kind of lives up to its name, especially in more recent years. There's a lot of interesting things happening around Dalymount. A lot of interesting things happening with the club and within the membership. I do think they're living up to their name at the moment and being quite bohemian and being quite eclectic and inclusive.
So as we've done in the episodes to date, I'll start by asking you what got you into football first of all, and then how did you come across Bohemians?
Well, I suppose I'm probably of that perfect age where I grew up in the kind of late 80s, early 90s here in Dublin when the Irish national team began their kind of golden age. I suppose anyone who was like my dad's generation or grandfather's generation probably saw Ireland struggle, manfully and fail at qualification for various World Cups and European Championships. But when I was a kid, we qualified for Euro 88, World Cup 90. We're very unlucky not to qualify for Euro 92, qualified for World Cup 94. We had all these great players as part of the team. You had the whole Jackie's Army sort of cultural phenomenon. And I know there's, say, a new film coming out about Jack Charlton, the impact he had. And, it was huge. Certainly, it broadened interest in football, and it basically created a certain feel-good atmosphere, absolutely, around the football team. And that got me interested in it as a kid. Collecting the Panini sticker albums and so on, and watching the matches on TV. And then when I was a little bit older, going to games as well. Always brought up on all sorts of sports. So I'd be brought to Dalymount to see Bohs play. Brought to Lansdowne Road to see Ireland. Would go to see the Dubs play in Croke Park or Parnell Park. Be brought to Morton Stadium for the athletics every year. All that sort of stuff. So I grew up with sport all around me. My dad was a former Bohs player. His uncle was a lifetime vice president of Bohemians as well. My family are from in and around that part of North Dublin where Bohs would be the local team and Dalymount would be somewhere that you would cross not infrequently. And I suppose then when I got a little bit older, became a member, and I've been a member now of Bohs, I think, for over 10 years at this stage, or will be as of next year. So it's it's part and parcel of my daily life now. I'm probably about a kilometre and a half walk from Dalymount Park. I really miss my Friday nights there, I have to say.
I bet.
Can't wait to get back. So Bohs is a big part of my kind of weekly existence, and I've kind of followed that interest into writing a few bits about the club. I'm a big interest in history as well, something I've studied. I'm trying to take that interest and turn it towards the club, because I think, especially in Ireland, we don't really do sports history as well as we could. There's been a big focus on it in recent years, and some excellent publications coming out now. I know there's an Atlas of Irish Sport being compiled at the moment, which is due for release in the next couple of years. You have great people like Paul Rouse or Cormac Moore or Conor Curran or people like that who are writing more about sports history and looking at, from quite a serious and academic point of view, about history of football and sport in Ireland. But in a way, I think that's also, just telling the great stories that are out there that are untold. And it's something I hope I try to do in a small way with the blog and the podcast. For anyone listening now, it's not all about Bohemians. I talk about the League of Ireland in general, the Irish national team. I have all sorts of stuff there about, Hungarian footballers in the 50s, or, kind of tours from South American sides in the 30s, and all sorts of kind of weird and wonderful things that capture my interest, and I hope kind of interest other people as well.
I grew up watching League of Ireland football in Kilkenny, but then living and studying in Dublin, being able to go to a game, being able to catch the bus over to Phibsborough, go to a Bohemians game, that was a real thrill for me. And what I always found going to Dalymount was the sense of history about it. It's an old style ground behind terraces of houses. You can walk from the pub, you can walk from the centre of Dublin up to the ground. It feels what football is supposed to be about.
I absolutely agree. I think I love the fact that, Dalymount Park opened in 1901. I mean, those red brick terraces are there. And I suppose for any maybe listeners in England and things like that, I mean, the closest I've seen there, I went to a Charlton game before. The Valley is not dissimilar, or even like Luton Town, Kenilworth Road, where it's kind of tucked in behind houses and things like that. It's a real almost kind of Edwardian football ground feel to that. And, you get into these laneways at the back of terraces and that. And as you say, the floodlight pylons are kind of iconic in the Dublin skyline. You can spot them from across most of North Dublin. It's something that's really appealed to me. The club is 130 years old this year, founded in 1890. So, and it's members owned as well, always has been. So it's a members club. We're 100% members owned. So I think there's about 800 odd members at the moment, at the last count. And we all own a share in the club. There's no majority shareholder. It's not even like the German model of the 50+1. Everyone has an equal share in the club. And look, I love that as well, that, I can go to an AGM and elect the club president and, approve the auditors or all that scintillating sort of stuff. And I think the onus has been put back on the wider sport base as well, that one of the board members is always saying that it's not just enough to pay your membership fee and you get your member card and that gets you into the matches. They want to encourage that ethos of volunteerism as well, so that, look, I've been there cleaning the terraces, weeding, pulling up weeds and things like that. I do the bits that I think I'm okay at, which is, I write a few articles for the programme or the website or things like that. But, everyone pitches in and does the bits that they're good at. And I think really that's helped grow the club from a situation where, and I think I might be even mentioned that Copa 90 documentary that you were watching, Joe. I mean, the club was pretty much close to bankruptcy not more than 10 years ago. There was a plan to sell Dalymount, this wonderful old 119-year-old football ground, and move out to kind of a brownfield site in the outer suburbs of Dublin. And in a weird way, the best thing that ever happened was this deal that would, at the time, have made us probably the wealthiest club in Ireland, collapsing along with the rest of the Irish economy. And we kind of had to basically fight to survive. Kind of new board came in, a new approach was taken, new attitudes were taken. I think our first team budget dropped by 90%. So that is, when you consider, we were winning league titles and winning doubles under Pat Fenn, we were in Europe. We were about 2 minutes away from knocking Red Bull Salzburg out of Europe, and that match still haunts me. But anyway, we went from that to basically being on the brink of going out of existence to coming back now, where we've just secured second place in the league. We're back in Europe again, confirmed for next year, which is the first kind of back-to-back seasons in Europe we've had for over 10 years. So the club is definitely on the up. We got a few quid from Matt Doherty's sell-on clause when he moved to Tottenham Hotspur.
You're welcome.
And like you said, there's a great history to the ground. I mean, everyone's played there, going back from, Zidane, Pele, Johan Cruyff, Franz Beckenbauer, all the way back to Fritz Walter or Stanley Matthews. And of course, all the great Irish players. I mean, Paul McGrath made his debut for Ireland there in a game against Italy, which was kind of infamous because I think about 40,000 people crammed their way into Dalymount Park, which is really not suitable for holding 40,000 people. And there's people climbing the pylons and standing on the roof and all that sort of stuff. And going all the way back to your Johnny Giles and things like that. And I mean, there's a great history to the ground. And it feels a little bit like you're kind of travelling back in time. I mean, parts of the ground were designed by Archibald Leach, and the terraces are still there, and there's a great sense of history to and great sense of place.
How well known is the history of Bohemians to regular Dubliners? Because you've obviously got the background that your family was involved with it, but how much would people know about it?
I like to think a bit more now. I like to think that I suppose the club have done a good job in presenting the message of the club, the ethos of the club. But again, I still think we're fairly, I don't want to say unknown, but I say the detail of the club and the history isn't probably that well known. And I'd say you could probably say the same thing for Shelbourne or Shamrock Rovers or St. Pat's Athletic. One thing that always kind of irks me a bit is there's a myth growing up about those famous floodlights that Bohs bought them second hand off Arsenal, that they used to be in Highbury, which actually one of the pieces on the blog is I kind of debunked that, because where that myth came from was we bought these new floodlights from a firm in Scotland, same guys who had done floodlights at Hamlin Park and Easter Road and other places, at considerable cost, what you'd almost call today crowdfunding, to pay this rather large sum of money for these, I think £20,000 back in 1962, which is a lot of money back then. Not an insignificant amount of money now. But they invited a team over to inaugurate the floodlights, and I suppose the only team they could find available at the time who would be a big draw were Arsenal. So Arsenal came over, played this match in 1962, and all of a sudden that turned into Arsenal were there at the inauguration match to we bought them second hand off Highbury. And I always get people going, oh, Bohs, yeah, do you know the floodlights used to be in Highbury? It's like, no, they weren't.
I think if the history of Bohemians isn't as widely known, the modern history of them is becoming much more known around Dublin. What they've done off the pitch is pretty incredible. Dalymount, I don't want to use the word hipster, so I won't use it, but it is the place to be on a Friday night in Dublin. Something Bohemians have done is really tapped into the local community with supporters initiatives, working in Mountjoy Prison, Refugees Welcome is the logo on the shirt. And Jerry, you mentioned Charlton Athletic, funnily enough. I attended a talk with the FAI from a representative of Charlton, which is intended to inform League of Ireland clubs what they could do to grow and progress. And what he said then was, you must become part of the local community. And that was the mid-2000s, and so many League of Ireland clubs didn't or couldn't do it for whatever reason. Bohemians have done that, and now they're reaping the rewards from it.
Absolutely, and Bohs have done it with very little resources, because, I mean, from basically putting out an invite to people to come watch a football match on a screen in one of the bars, we now have groups from direct vision centres being able to go to matches, and then the collaboration with Amnesty and the Refugees Welcome. The Bohemian Foundation, which is kind of the charitable offshoot of the club, does a lot of great work with the prisoners in Mountjoy and the women's prison, the Docus Centre as well. And it's brought an awful lot of goodwill. And look, that wasn't always the case. When I was going to matches, first of all, I don't think we necessarily had that same connection with the community. I never thought 10 years ago, when we were scrimping and saving to try and pay creditors who were looking for their money, I never thought that in 10 years' time we'd be where we are now, but it's great to see.
Jerry, you referenced how you can't go see Bohs at the moment because of the modern day pandemic. So let's jump back 100 years to the last great global pandemic.
And for the next quarter of an hour, the crowd are treated to some of the slickest play ever seen at Dalymount.
Tens of thousands of Irishmen signed up to the British war effort.
If the lads got killed, you couldn't bury them right away because that was an easy target for the Jerrys.
This unknown enemy is starting to sweep through.
The war is over.
Spanish flu has been, some people call, a forgotten pandemic.
Up and down the street they parade, delirious with joy. Their influenza mask.
There have been over 50,000 cases of COVID-19 in Ireland.
The government has decided that the evidence of a potentially grave situation arising is now too strong.
Here is Mandrew. Second position. Oh, what a goal!
Corcoran with the dummy. Kenny! 3-0!
They've worked their socks off.
It's exciting times, I believe, for the club.
A tremendous performance by the Dublin side.
Your article, it's called Bohs in the Time of Influenza, so I'll let you set the scene.
Yeah, that's my vague literary reference to Garcia Marquez's Love in the Time of Cholera. I don't know if anyone picked up on that. But when people were looking for comparisons with COVID-19 and lockdowns and the kind of global nature of this virus, they were struggling with comparison. I suppose the nearest thing people could relate back to was the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 and 1919. Like I say in the article, Spanish flu is a bit of misnomer because it didn't originate in Spain. It's just because World War I was ongoing at the time. You know, this virus was rife in the trenches of the war and things like that. It was in Germany, it was in France. It originated, we believe, in Kansas in the United States. And it was actually some American soldiers bringing it into the European theatre of war. But because Spain was neutral, the Spanish newspapers reported on it and this influenza epidemic, and therefore it got the moniker of the Spanish flu, which is a bit unfair on the Spaniards because everyone had this flu. It was truly global. And then, of course, millions of soldiers are demobbed and are sent home. And, of course, that's a great vector for infection because there's millions of guys travelling around the world, going back home and infecting everyone else. It's crazy when you think about it. So we've passed 1 million deaths now with COVID-19. But if you look back to 1918, 1919, the conservative estimates is that 50 million people were killed. And some people even say that figure is way too conservative because we don't have accurate figures for places like China, for some parts of Africa and so on.
Yeah.
So that the true figures may be much higher and could be 80, 90 million plus.
Wow.
And obviously a much smaller world population than 100 years ago. So that's a scary number. And obviously it really affected Ireland. So a conservative estimate is about 210,000 Irishmen fought in the First World War. It's probably actually considerably higher because there's Irishmen in the Canadian Army, the American Army, the Australian Army. So it could be well over 250,000. And according to different estimates, that maybe somewhere between kind of 20 and 40,000 of them may have perished in that war. But well over 20,000 people were killed within a year of the Spanish flu in Ireland alone. So if you consider even the figures we have for COVID-19, we've already lost well over 1,000 people. In the period of probably 8 or 9 months, we had 20 times that.
Right.
100 odd years ago. It was scary. And I suppose the big difference between COVID-19 and the Spanish flu was COVID-19 has disproportionately affected older people. Spanish flu was weird in that it disproportionately affected young, healthy people. What one theory is that your younger, healthier people have a stronger autoimmune kind of response, and that their immune system basically went into overdrive, and it was actually the immune system of the person reacting against the virus that killed them. So you had terrible situations where you had like people in their 20s and 30s dying and leaving young children, without parents and leaving them as orphans. But then, of course, daily life continued. So you had a lot of things that we would be familiar with today. People were wearing masks. A lot of businesses did close down. People did self-quarantine. But we also had things that kind of continued to happen. Schools were closed in some cases, and big sporting events were postponed. But football did continue, and I write in the article there that you had matches with 6,000, 8,000 people at them, and it was a strange time for football in Ireland as well, because the Irish team were home nations champions, so similar to the way Six Nations is now. So Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales played a championship every year, and kind of continued to do so with Northern Ireland as well up until the 1980s. You got to remember, there's no border at the time, but it was the first time Ireland had won it outright in 1914. And of course, the war breaks out. That great team is broken up, and then what happens with the Irish League? So the Irish League is dominated by the big Belfast clubs. So generally, it's Belfast teams, a team maybe like Derry Celtic, and generally Bohemians and Shelbourne, who were the two kind of dominant Dublin clubs at the time. And when that happens, they basically split the league. So it's kind of an Antrim and district kind of league, and then there's a kind of a Dublin and district league. So there isn't actually a standard league of Ireland. And even then, the Irish Cup, which does continue, but even that becomes regionalised. So you get situations where Bohs are constantly playing Shells in the opening round of the Cup because the Dublin teams play off against each other and all that sort of stuff. The war had a huge impact, obviously, as well. Thousands of football players and football fans are going to the front. The number of clubs affiliated with the Leinster Football Association kind of halved at one stage over the course of the war. Obviously, crowd numbers are down. So, it's a very challenging time. So peace is declared, and people understandably are anxious to get back to normal. So in some ways, the football clubs are delighted that crowds are beginning to come back. And, you have that happening even when, the numbers are really, really high. I have a stat here. There was 3 peaks in that 1819 Spanish flu. Kind of one of them happened around this time of year, October, November. One theory is that it was made worse by the fact that everyone was celebrating Armistice Day. So everyone went, the war's over, what do? You go out and meet all your friends and have a big party, which is a great way to spread a virus as well, of course. But I read a kind of shocking statistic in the Irish Times that between the 28th of September and the 9th of November, 756 people died of the Spanish flu in Dublin alone. That's just in Dublin City, which is crazy in the space of, what's that? That's probably less than 6 weeks. So, and at the time, Bohs and Shells and a lot of the other clubs are playing matches against each other, and you're having 6, 7, 8,000 people crammed into games. And even then, the cup final takes place, and because Bohs obviously didn't make the cup final, they kind of play an alternate cup final where they play one of the defeated semi-finalist teams, which is Belfast Celtic, and they bring them down from Belfast to play in Dalymount. And again, there's another huge crowd there. So Bohs at the time, at the height of Spanish flu, have bumper attendances in Dalymount Park, and similarly Shelbourne do in Shelbourne Park, and obviously there's still games going on up in Belfast as well with Linfield or Glentoran, and the Irish Cup final takes place and there's a crowd of 10,000 or so at it. So there are big attendances. There's no ban on sports, so people are still, some games are postponed or moved, but they're not cancelled. They do happen. You got to remember, most people are crammed in on terraces. There's usually a reserve stand for the people who want to pay the bit extra, but probably 80-90% of people are on quite busy terraces around football grounds.
Was there any sense from your research of kind of public outcry about sporting events taking place or League of Ireland games continuing?
There's not really. It's funny, at the time people understand it's not like previous mass pandemic outbreaks from the 19th century, because I suppose science had moved on a bit. People were beginning to understand how disease was passed. People understood about germ theory as well, which kind of emerged in the late 19th century. And when you talk about like previous things like cholera outbreaks and typhoid outbreaks, people kind of knew it was passed somehow, but they weren't 100% sure. Some people thought it's through water. Some people had this idea it's miasma, that it's just in the air. And I suppose they kind of understand what that means, but they don't understand what a microscopic germ is. By the time of the Spanish flu, people kind of have a better idea. in popular conscious what that means. So they kind of know how viruses are passed. From what I've seen anyway, from researching kind of newspaper articles at the time, there's no contemporary account saying, oh, well, this shouldn't happen or these games shouldn't take place. Most of the stuff is people are delighted that the crowds, which were so low during wartime, are now coming back, and that isn't it great that sport is thriving again. There's a return to a certain level of normality post-war in terms of social life and things like that as well.
Was there any indication that any of the players were getting ill? So you were saying earlier that it sort of acts like the Spanish flu sort of acted like an autoimmune disease. So the healthier you are, the more likely you are to succumb to it. So the footballers must have been the youngest and the healthiest of the lot, and then they were surrounded by masses of people every single week. So were teams getting decimated?
Yeah, absolutely. Names escape me, but there are many references to players. Again, like you say, Joe, guys in their 20s and 30s who were fit, healthy men dying. I mentioned there Bloody Sunday. I know that a couple of the Tipperary Gaelic team who played in Croke Park on that day had died in the interim, and again they were fit, healthy young men. So the Spanish flu killed an awful lot of young, healthy people, and there were numerous sportsmen and athletes among them, and it did have a big impact. And you do see quite regularly, as you're looking through the newspapers, deaths listed: young men, Spanish flu or influenza, and then you'll see a member of such and such a club or a prominent member of this, and it's across all sports. And a lot of cases, especially Bohs members, were often very active in a lot of sports, so they would play football or as well as tennis or cricket or Gaelic football or whatever else. You're having yourself water polo.
I was just going to say, it's amazing that this sort of puts, and people say this all the time, but it sort of puts what's happening now into perspective. Where there's riots, well, not riots, but there's people going into Trafalgar Square in their thousands because the pubs are going to be shut for 4 weeks. And 100 years ago, they were like, we just want to go and watch football. We're happy to risk imminent death. And then they probably would have died. But it just seemed like a much hardier time.
Yeah, and I mean, they were going to cinemas, they were going to theatres, they were going to kind of other sort of social events. Pubs did close, but it wasn't a prescriptive sort of thing. Sometimes the pubs closed because the family that was running the pub, someone had got the flu and they shut down from that point of view. And some people kind of self-isolated, as we would say now. But generally speaking, there wasn't that sort of government intervention where you're saying you have to shut the following.
I think that whole period in Irish history is fascinating anyway. But when you look at it as you do, Jerry, through the prism of sports and League of Ireland football, again, you reference in the piece just how volatile Ireland was. We'd had the 1916 Rising, the First World War, now the Spanish flu, about to undertake a war of independence, a civil war. In the middle of this, football is continuing. Your piece talks about having to release players from British regiments to play. And you talk about players who lost their lives in the war and supporters who as well passed away. The whole period is incredible to think about what's going on, and football continues throughout all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, if you look at different estimates, James, say somewhere like Dublin, which 100 years ago was a much smaller city. I mean, Dublin is 1.2 million people now. It was much, much smaller then. It was a fraction the size of that, probably less than a quarter the size of that. But you had, based on some estimates, over 8,000 Dubliners alone died in the First World War, and then probably a comparative number dying of Spanish flu. Now think about anything that would kill 10 to 15,000 people in the space of 4 or 5 years in a city like Dublin today. I mean, it would be front page news all the time. We'd be talking about it forever. People persisted through an awful lot of tragedy then. I've tracked over 40 players and members of Bohemians who were involved in the First World War. Several of them died. Harold Sloan, probably the most famous, who was Irish international centre forward, scored a hat-trick in the first filmed international match, a 3-3 draw with Wales in the racecourse ground in Wrexham, as far as I know. Unfortunately, of course, because it was the first ever, there's one camera, and it was basically filmed the lads going on and off at half time. You don't see any of Harold's goals. You see him trotting off the pitch, but he scored a hat-trick in the first filmed international match. But yeah, he dies in 1917, and then his son enlists during the Second World War, and he's killed in the 1940s, which is really tragic. There's huge connections, and of course some of those players, there's quite a couple of prominent guys. A guy called Emmett Dalton who comes back from the First World War, and within 2 years of returning from he's at the Battle of the Somme, he's He's involved in the RAF. He's training snipers in Palestine and North Africa. He comes back within 2 years. He is head of training for the IRA during the War of Independence. And of course, he's a first team player for Bohs as well, and later becomes club president. So you have crazy stories like this that cross all sorts of different political spectrums, and that's why I like looking at stuff through the prism of sport, because you don't know where it's accessible, it's something that people are familiar with, and you don't know where those little stories are going to lead you to. It's a nice little window into wider history, because I think sometimes if you're talking about kind of that decade, say from the lockout in 1913 to the end of the Civil War, it feels too big. It feels like there's too much stuff going on. You have a world war, you have a war of independence, you have the Rising, you have the Spanish flu. There's too much stuff going on to deal with all that. But you tell the story through the history of a football club and the people involved and the way that their lives intersected with these historical events. I think that's maybe a more accessible way for people to engage with history.
It's such a pleasure to have this article in the magazine, Jerry, because not only is it fascinating in its own right, it gives context to Ireland's history and Ireland's football history.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
And hopefully it won't be too long before we can get back to normal and you can get back to Dalymount Park, Ger.
Well, here's hoping.
Check out Jerry's podcast and website, A Bohemian Sporting Life, and pick up your copy of issue 6 to delve deeper into that article. And thanks as ever to you, Joe, for joining us.
No problem. Cheers again.
And that's it for the latest episode of the Pogue McGoal podcast. Tell us what you think by contacting us on social media at Pogue McGoal. And listen out for future editions with more guests who's contributed to both the magazine and website. Don't forget, you can now order issue 6 of the Pogue McGoal magazine right now from poguemcgoal.bigcartel.com. And join us next time on the Pogue McGoal podcast.